So what we're doing today is I'll first talk about some of the problems that I believe are old problems and how their answers have been changed in this world, which is the world of social data, where social data is data people create and share. So I'm not talking about PR, but I'm talking about the data we create. For instance, think about geolocation, where you are at a given point in time, that you might choose to share. We're looking at what has changed and what hasn't changed. And then I take the Amazon approach, I was the chief scientist at Amazon.com, of saying, okay, what are the metrics? What does it mean to do well? What does it mean to do poorly? And I do this for a number of verticals, which I think are being transformed through the data we create and share. Then I drill down a bit and look at the specific data sources, because it's easy to talk about stuff in the abstract, but what specifically are examples that changes our way, the way we live. And when I say we, I'm talking about 1 billion people. 1 billion people make shopping decisions based differently on the data others created and shared. Think Amazon.com, reviews and recommendations. 1 billion people think about who they are differently based on what they see on Facebook, how they share on Facebook, how they see what Facebook shows them about their friends. 1 billion people think about information differently based on what they see by looking at Baidu or by looking at Google or whatever they use as search engines. What's the effect of that on health, on education, on other areas? I will give you my favorite metaphor, which is data is the new oil, and we'll look at this in terms of production, distribution, then oil refineries, and finally the consumption. And I'll end with a question. And the question is, if you had all the data in the world freely available at your fingertips, what is the most controversial prediction that highlights one of these trade-offs, for instance, privacy, that your table can come up with? So I talk for about 10 minutes, and the goal is to have you come up with controversial predictions with your table and with each other. Okay? All right. So I want to start in looking at a few problems. For instance, the first problem is, what should I buy? Think about, how did you discover the last 10 things you bought? And you'll be surprised about how many of those you discovered through others. Because, the reason we buy stuff is we want to impress other people. We are social beings. What route should I take? Do you remember a time when there were maps? Maps, printed objects. Anybody remember that? So think how the world has changed and how we take it for granted that real-time traffic decisions, real-time traffic information is projected to us to help us with that decision. Are we taking the 101 or the 280 between Stanford and San Francisco? Not complicated models that predict laminar flow versus turbulent flow, but just with what speed are the cars moving right now on the freeways? What should I pay attention to? Who should I pay attention to? What should I eat? What medicine should I take? How do different medicines interact? How do they actually apply to me, personalized medicine? Who should I work with? Whether that's an overall job, employment, or in this gig economy, who should I give the little job I have to turn this into PowerPoint, for instance, to? Who to date? In all of these examples, I argue, the decisions we make are now based on data, on social data, on data people create and share. Sometimes willingly and knowingly, sometimes a bit less willingly and a bit less knowingly. So, what has changed and what hasn't changed in these problems? I think the key thing that has changed is the expectation. The expectation that we know the state of the world. We know where that plane is. We know how that train runs. We know about the hotel rooms. And the unit of analysis is not longer the Marriott chain, but it's a specific room at a specific hotel where we expect to know whether we have a view or whether it's next to the elevator. It really has changed that we have digitized ourselves. When I asked my undergrads at Stanford, what will your digital footprint be in 2020? What do you think they said? They said, our digital footprint will include all the feelings we have towards other people. Like you know that about 7 minutes into the talk, it's now half of the audience is falling asleep and the other half is having sexual fantasies. So that means we digitize our transactions, our interactions, our desires. People metrics, meaning in a company, we understand who empowers you, who shuts you down. We are day one as far as these things goes, but we carry the devices with us that manage to create those measurements, mobile phones. Because after all, what do you touch more often than your mobile phone? In the world a number of you live in the world of media, ads, of course, play an important role. But how do we know what role an ad played in the decision-making process that led to the purchase of a product? Attribution is a key problem. So how can, by digitizing our interactions, how can we make ads more effective or the payment for ads more fair? Think about what long way we have come. Only 10 years ago, a paper used to arrive at home. That is the day when we had maps, and nobody knew whether I was even opening it, let alone how long my eyes lingered on that page. Now, I have a Samsung S4. That Samsung looks at my eyes. It knows how much attention I'm paying to the ad, to that piece of the page. I can even turn the page with my eyes alone. That is commercially available right now. Or the other thing which is not quite yet commercially available is, of course, Google Glass. It's a brilliant idea for Google to measure out the world, to have millions of people as the tentacles of the octopus, measuring out the shelves of the Walmarts and the Best Buys of the world, weighted by the attention of the individual. So by giving you a little bit back that you might be able to get that item cheaper at Amazon.com or somewhere else, they get you to measure out the universe and to report it back to headquarters in Mountain View. That is pretty amazing. That is what Google Glass is about. So digitizing our interactions with the world, weighted by our attention, that I think is what really has changed. And when I talked about expectations, I'm a physicist by training. I think about the world in terms of time scales. And specifically, I think about innovation, about how long does it take to get the answers to a question. And those feedback times, I think, is what at the heart drives innovation in the internet space, in the mobile space. So we've talked about problems and we've talked about what has changed. A couple of very quick remarks on metrics. Amazon carefully divides the world into inputs and into outputs. The inputs are what you can change, the output is what happens. So like a conversion rate, what is that? It's an input and output. It's an output. So you have to figure out what is it that you can change. Let's look at a few ways how to combine those different metrics, those outputs, into what I call the equation of business. For example, let's take the call center. So traditionally, it turns out that people who call the call center and get a problem resolved actually are happy. They are better customers by a number of metrics, and people never call the call center. So what should we do? Ship everybody the wrong shit and have them call up the call center? No. So that's not the right action. So you have to do these natural experiments. By the way, I haven't told this story much. Do you know why there is free shipping? It's because the French made a mistake in the coding. And in the late 90s, they didn't code shipping costs right. So shipping costs were zero. And we saw a spike in orders. And that's where the idea of having free shipping actually came on. Since we're beating up the French here, let me tell one more story. And that is when Amazon ran out a new recommendation system. It turned out it worked amazingly well in Germany. It totally bombed in France and no effect in Japan. How is that possible? The answer was the Germans love English words, English titles. French, of course, loathe English titles, and the Japanese have no idea. So these are all the experiments, can talk to you for ages. Metrics. So we talked about metrics, and Amazon's mantra is to express these metrics in customer-centric terms. So it's your experience with the call center and not the call center agent. It is your experience, for instance, about how many items there are. We call it view-weighted availability. It doesn't matter how much stuff is in the shelves. It matters what do people look at. So that view-weighted availability, which is pretty standard online, now can come with Google Glass to the offline world. In media, Claudia always says any single metric you optimize for is almost certainly wrong. It is finding the balance between a whole bunch of things. Health. I think once a year one should go with the doctor. The doctor takes the pulse, writes it down. In America, he actually has copyright on that, in case you were wondering. And think about that compared to now. You can, for $100, buy a camera you can swallow, which measures out whatever's going on down there until it's done. I hear you can recycle it, but I don't want to talk about that here. And I heard that in Japan, there are some toilets, these modern toilets, which actually analyze your urine. As you pee, they actually find out whether you are pregnant or something. Why are people interested in pregnancy? Why does the Target example, who knows a Target example in pregnancy?
Father,
yeah, exactly. Why does Target care? Because that's where the money is. If you know that a child will be born in the months leading up to the birth, and particularly the month after the birth, it's amazing how much stuff you can sell to people. So that's why they started pregnancy so hard. And that's why they come up with the predictions based on what people buy and look at. Learning is very hard. The future of learning clearly is not in MOOCs and in just shipping pages to the world. But it is in getting people to talk to each other. Just like Monty tries you to get to talk to each other at the table. So it's an n-squared problem as opposed to the 1 to the n problem. I'm super interested in all these things, but I want to push through. Work, what's the metric there? Not easy either. How do you measure the happiness or the delight of people at work? So after talking about problems and what has changed, what hasn't changed, whatever you do, think about the metrics. Third point is data sources. Data sources fall into 4 groups: implicit, explicit, contextual, and then social. Let's talk Amazon recommendation as an example. Implicit data is based on the clicks, big matrix, co-clicking behavior. People click it, also click at. You project it out and you tell people, hey, you might also be interested in looking at those items. Explicit, think reviews, think where people can publish stuff to the world, think Twitter. Context, we're just starting with context. Context is the boxes we carry measuring out how we are doing. Are we in a hurry? Are we open to new suggestions? Are we already at the end of the purchasing funnel ready to buy? And an example from a focus interview I had a few years ago when Claudia read through it and then misunderstood something which I thought was interesting. Because I just had naively the thought that if I need to be somewhere and I'm walking and I'm 10 minutes away and the meeting starts in 2 minutes, probably my mobile will figure out that I'm in a hurry. It might not be the perfect time for somebody to call me and try to sell me something. But the way Claudia read it was, as I'm walking on the street, it really understands the paces, how I'm walking, and can early detect if I, for instance, have a back problem. That it knows that the pace is slightly different from the way it is normally, maybe not as symmetrical. And so it's just amazing how far ahead of the time she was. I didn't think about this, but that's how I always get new ideas. But people misunderstanding what I say, and then I'm trying to understand it from them. So that's the context here. It's about instrumenting people, etc., etc. Instrumenting interaction is called people analytics. And the last one is social graph, the relationships, not just who is connected with whom, a la LinkedIn, a la Xing, but it is how often does Go hit me up and I don't write back? Or how many likes do I get from somebody without liking them back? Or whose photos do I click through every single one of them without even telling them? So social graph, very asymmetrical, understanding what people are good for. So we talked about data sets. Sometimes I talk about tool sets or skill sets. That's what I teach at the university, but ultimately those are commodities. Data is not a commodity. Use your creativity to come up with new data sets. Tool sets and skill sets, although good people are always rare, is not where the big change lies. It is the mindset. And as I said, it's the mindset of 1 billion people. Now to be clear, the social data revolution wouldn't have happened without technology. So let's say without Twitter, without Facebook, we wouldn't be living in the world we live in. But also, without the mindset of people, we wouldn't have Facebook and Twitter playing the role in our lives it does play. And it's so sad to see how few companies actually get it. They still have these, like us on Facebook and you get a few dollar off and stuff like this. I mean, that's just so not understanding that it's about C2C as opposed to engagement with a brand. But that's a different talk. Who is leading? Who is following? So I personally think that the focus we should have is on the changing social norms. So we know that data changes, doubles every 1.5 years, and we know that from the beginning of time until the end of 2012, less data was created than we create this year alone. Actually, let me do this one fresh. We all know that from the beginning of time till the end of 2011, less data was created than we are creating this year alone. So that is changing fast. But how are the social norms changing? So for instance, if I find some juicy profile of Monty on that dating site or at Craigslist, you name it, maybe even with a photo with the EXIF location that I know that he's actually staying at the Millennium, and I repost this on my Facebook friends and saying, I couldn't believe what I saw about Monty. What is people's reaction? Will they think Andreas is a weird guy? Or will they think Monty is a weird guy? It used to be that Monty gets the blame. We now have seen, and I can give you a number of examples, that it shifted because everybody does weird stuff. So now actually it is the person who posts or reposts something who gets the blame. A friend of mine, his brother, when something happens which he doesn't like much on Grindr, which is one of the dating apps, he just takes a screenshot and posts it on Facebook. And it's very interesting, given this small universe in San Francisco, that the people interested in him are probably also the people interested in his friends, that really changed the sort of inappropriate posting behavior that he experienced on Grindr. So by making the private public, by changing the default, you change the behavior of people. So rather than going through this metaphor of data as the new oil, which I milked at a talk I gave at the United Nations 1.5 years ago, let's close by hopefully having give you enough information and enough stimulation and enough inspiration to think about the question: if you had all the data of the world freely available at your fingertips, come up at your table with one controversial prediction. You might think about trade-offs. You might think about the value of data, which is the decisions they influence. You might think about where is it a different game we play, not just the better, faster, cheaper plane. You might think about where we are going and maybe where we want to be going. But on that note, I'll leave the question up here. Maybe we should combine like two people sitting over there, Robbie, Augustine, if you want to just join with other people here, and maybe the two of you join our table. Give people, I don't know, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, just to come up with one controversial thing, to write it on a piece of paper. Monty and I will collect those in, say, 3 minutes, but we give them 5, and then we'll just quickly read them off. That's the most effective thing in time. All right.